Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. President Joe Biden signs an executive order to temporarily shut down asylum requests at the U.S. Mexico border if the average number of daily encounters with migrants is more than 2,500 between official ports of entry. Attorney General Merrick Garland tells the House Judiciary Committee that he and the Justice Department will not be intimidated by what he calls Republican conspiracy theories that the department is being weaponized against former President Donald Trump. House starts work on the first of 12 annual government spending bills for fiscal year 2025, covering military construction and veterans affairs, with disagreements over policy riders the Republicans have added, including on abortion and reproductive health care and diversity, equity, and inclusion. House passes a bill to sanction the International Criminal Court after its lead prosecutor seeks arrest warrants for Israel's prime minister and defense minister over the war in Gaza. And today is the 35th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's 1989 deadly crackdown on protesters in Tiananmen Square. And there's bipartisan U.S. pledges to stand with the people of China against oppression from the CCP. Story from CBS News. President Biden on Tuesday unveiled new executive action authorizing U.S. immigration officials to deport large numbers of migrants without processing their asylum claims, announcing what is arguably the most restrictive border policy by a Democratic president in recent history. Mr. Biden's aggressive move suspends the processing of asylum claims between official entry points along the southern border, allowing U.S. authorities to more quickly reject and deport migrants who enter the country unlawfully. The partial ban on asylum claims will take effect at 12:01 a.m. Wednesday. Regular asylum processing will only be restored 14 days after the Secretary of Homeland Security determines that the weekly average of daily illegal border crossings has dipped below 1,500, and the proclamation could be activated again if the weekly average of daily crossings between ports of entry surpasses 2,500. That was from CBS News. President Biden made this announcement at the White House.
Today, I'm joined by a bipartisan group of governors, members of Congress, mayors, law enforcement officials, most of whom live and work along the southern border. They know the border is not a political issue to be weaponized. The responsibility we have to share to do something about it. They don't have time for the games played in Washington, and neither do the American people. So today, I'm moving past Republican obstruction and using the executive authorities available to me as president to do what I can on my own to address the border. Frankly, I would have preferred to address this issue through bipartisan legislation because that's the only way to actually get the kind of system we have now that's broken, fixed, to hire more Border Patrol agents, more asylum officers, more judges. But Republicans have left me no choice. Today, I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. Migrants will be restricted from receiving asylum at our southern border unless they seek it after entering through an established lawful process. And those who seek to come to the United States legally, for example, by making an appointment and coming to a port of entry, asylum will still be available to them, still available. But if an individual chooses not to use our legal pathways, if they choose to come without permission and against the law, they'll be restricted from receiving asylum and staying in the United States. This action will help us gain control of our border, restore order into the process. This ban will remain in place until the number of people trying to enter illegally is reduced to a level that our system can effectively manage. We'll carry out this order consistent with all our responsibilities under international law, every one of them. In addition to this action, we recently made important reforms in our asylum system, more efficient and more secure reforms. The goal is to deliver decisions on asylum as quickly as possible.
President Biden at the White House. Joining him were the mayors of several cities in Texas, San Antonio, El Paso, Laredo, and Brownsville among them. Also, Democratic U.S. Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona and Democratic governors Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico and Kathy Hochul of New York, plus a half dozen Democratic U.S. House members from Texas, California, and New York. During his remarks, President Biden also made a distinction between his approach to the border and immigration and that of his likely Republican opponent in this year's presidential election, former President Donald Trump.
I believe that immigration has always been the lifeblood of America. We're constantly renewed by an infusion of people and new talent. The Statue of Liberty is not some relic of American history. It stands for who we are as the United States. So I will never demonize immigrants. I'll never refer to immigrants as poisoning the blood of a country. And further, I'll never separate children from their families at the border. I will not ban people from this country because of their religious beliefs. I will not use the U.S. military to go into neighborhoods all across the country to pull millions of people out of their homes and away from their families to put detention camps while awaiting deportation, as my predecessor says he will do if he occupies his office again.
President Biden at the White House. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, put out a statement just as the president was making his announcement. Statement along with the rest of the House Republican leadership that begins, President Biden's executive order is nothing more than a desperate political stunt to try and stabilize his plummeting poll numbers. From his first day in office, Biden has worked to implement a failed open border agenda, which created this historic humanitarian and national security catastrophe. Speaker Johnson spoke about this at a morning news conference before the executive order came out, but when it was clear that it was coming.
I just want to tell you one important number, 126. It was 126 days ago today that Joe Biden said, quote, "I've done all I can do." He was asked about why he wouldn't use his extensive executive authority to address the border catastrophe that he himself created. And 126 days ago, he looked into the cameras and said, I'm out of options. I've done all I can do. He tried to convince us all for all this time that there was no way he could possibly fix the mess. Remember that he engineered it. When Congressman Siscomani said a few moments ago, he began this on the day he took office over 3.5 years ago. He walked into the Oval Office and he started issuing executive orders, dozens of them. We counted 64 specific executive actions that President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas took to open that border wide. They did it intentionally. They engineered the open border. There's no question about it. The evidence is so clear. And now, suddenly, now he wants to issue some weak executive order. One executive order, supposedly to try to address the issue. It's window dressing. Everybody knows it. If he was concerned about the border, he would have done this a long time ago. And we don't know what's in this. The devil will definitely be in the details here, I can assure you. But from what we're hearing, it will ignore multiple elements that have to be addressed, the elements that were in our legislation that we passed over 14 months ago, to fix the broken asylum program, to fix the broken parole process, to reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy, to end the catch and release policy that they've advanced. Those are the reasons that this catastrophe has been allowed to continue, and whatever little short measure that he's going to do here is not going to solve the problem. In fact, by some estimates, it might make it worse because it will extend once again the welcome mat. Incentivize people to come and be among the first 2,500 is what we're hearing. The first 2,500 per day to come in to be ensured that you get your welcome package when you come into the country illegally. It's absolute madness. They're going to say he's using Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. You know what? I read him that provision myself on the telephone a year ago, 7 months ago, I know, after I became Speaker, we had this conversation. I told him this. First, he tried to tell me it didn't exist. Then I read him the language on the phone. Later, I met with him in person, reiterated the same language. And that provision is so broad, it allows the president to use his authority unilaterally if he determines it to be in the best interest of the country. If it's detrimental to the interest of our country, he can close the border down entirely. He's not going to do that. He has no interest in doing that. They want it wide open.
House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, at a news conference this morning before the executive order from the president, and it was at 2,500 average daily crossings between ports per day for a week to trigger the shutdown of asylum. And Biden administration officials say that has already been reached, so the shutdown would happen at 12:01 a.m. Wednesday. The ACLU putting out a post the Biden administration just announced. They write an executive order that will severely restrict people's legal right to seek asylum, putting tens of thousands of lives at risk. This action takes the same approach as the Trump administration's asylum ban. We will be challenging this order in court. Congressman Greg Casar, Democrat of Texas, was interviewed on MSNBC today about the executive order.
I have real disagreements and concerns with this executive action because I think it plays into the current Republican talking points. You see, the Republican Party here in Congress tries to cover up its own failures by scapegoating immigrants. It's the oldest trick in the book. And they continue to advocate for closing legal pathways to migration and pointing at chaos at the border. Unfortunately, they've created this political pressure that has the president today responding by restricting asylum, which isn't going to work because it doesn't actually reduce the number of people being pushed out of their homes in Latin America. It doesn't actually create new legal pathways for people to migrate here. And so I think we need an alternative, progressive vision for what will work on the border. And that's why today I'm announcing that I'm drafting legislation to drastically reduce the amount that the United States is contributing to forced migration. I think if we want to address what's happening at the border, we need to create legal pathways so that folks don't have to go to the cartels or wait in line at the border. If we want to address what's going on in our community on immigration, we should finally provide protections to our dreamers and to longtime families here. And then third, we need to do what folks in D.C. don't want to talk about, which is how are U.S. policies actually contributing, especially in places like Latin America, to starvation and poverty and violence that is pushing people out of their homes in record numbers. That's why I'm drafting legislation to finally start tackling that issue.
Congressman Greg Casar, Democrat from Texas, today on MSNBC. Some more reaction to the president's executive order from senators. Alex Padilla, Democrat of California, posting on X, by reviving a Trump-era asylum ban, President Biden has abandoned our obligations to provide people fleeing persecution, violence, and authoritarianism with an opportunity to seek refuge in the United States. And Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat from Arizona, who attended today's executive order signing, putting out a statement. President Biden's plan is a welcome action that will help address urgent needs at the border. In Arizona, where Border Patrol agents and nonprofits are often overwhelmed by daily migrant crossings, this new effort will support their crucial work and help relieve border communities from the burden of our broken immigration system. But make no mistake, this is only necessary because Congress has failed to do its duty to help fix the border, and there is no substitute for that. That was from Senator Mark Kelly. Border security was one of the topics at today's Senate Appropriations Subcommittee hearing with the FBI Director Christopher Wray. Senator Jerry Moran, Republican of Kansas, is the ranking member.
Director, I mentioned in my opening statement the southern border and the challenges that we've had at the border. I mentioned a member of ISIS. I mentioned a NBC News report about an individual that was on the terrorist watch list that was released. I recognize that the primary responsibility implicates the failures at the Department of Homeland Security, but the FBI Terrorist Screening Center is the primary federal entity responsible for national security screening and for facilitating the sharing of information across government. Do these cases reflect a breakdown in our efforts to ensure that all government partners have full, actionable information they need to protect our citizens from terrorism?
So I'm not sure I can discuss specific examples, but let me try to get at your question this way. So certainly we have seen over the last 5 to 6 years an increase in the number of known or suspected terrorists, in other words, watch-listed subjects attempting to cross the border. And that is of concern, and that's where there's a lash-up between the TSC and CBP at the border that I think in general works pretty well. The bigger problem, in my view, is twofold. One, individuals who, when they come in, are either armed with fake documents or snuck in some way, or, and this is very important, individuals for whom there's not enough derogatory information in the intelligence community to watch list them yet. So let me just unpack that a little bit, because this is an important point, because it kind of goes to what Senator Collins was asking me about, and it may relate a little bit to your other hat on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So as we collect collectively across the intelligence community and with our partners less information about foreign terrorists overseas, there's less information to be had about who the people coming into this country are, which then means...
Would you say that sentence again? I missed the first part of the sentence.
So the way I look at it is, as we have less collection overseas against foreign terrorism, there's less sources of information to inform people about people coming in. So in other words, somebody could be coming in who should be watch listed, but isn't. And it's not because of a breakdown between CBP and the TSC. It's because the information that should have told everybody that this person is a threat has not yet been unearthed by whatever intelligence agency it is out there. Because it's not just the FBI that puts people on the watch list. We're getting information from lots of other agencies. So as we pull out of Afghanistan, for example, you get less and less information about whether somebody from Afghanistan is actually a threat. And so some of the cases that I have seen that concern me are situations where somebody comes into the United States. It's not because there was a breakdown between CBP and the TSC. It's because they weren't watch listed at the time. But in hindsight, they should have been watch listed because information was later developed that says, uh-oh, this person is a problem. You see what I'm saying there, right? That's a much bigger concern. In my view. And so we really need to be focusing on how we can try to address that with the rest of the intelligence community, with our partners, and so forth. When that happens, when we find somebody who's here in the United States who we now then know this person needs to be put on the watch list, then we use our joint terrorism task forces to go out and try to find the person, work with our state and local partners. We have the backstop of 800,000 sworn law enforcement, et cetera. But that to me is a bigger concern than the number of KSTs.
Director, just a brief follow-up. Is there a delay in timing once someone is known, it's known that they should be on the watch list? Is there a delay before it's known across government agencies?
I don't know about delay. I mean, there's an interagency process.
How long does it take?
I think it varies is the short answer. I mean, it's not just the FBI can snap its fingers and put somebody on the list. There's an interagency, very rigorous process to protect civil liberties and other things to put somebody on the watch list. But once they're on the watch list, there's pretty much instantaneous notification to the relevant parties. Yeah.
FBI Director Christopher Wray testifying before a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, getting questions from the ranking Republican on that committee, Jerry Moran of Kansas, a hearing focusing on the fiscal year 2025 budget request from the president for the FBI. Attorney General Merrick Garland, writes Associated Press, rebuked what he described as unprecedented attacks on the Justice Department Tuesday, telling Republicans who have sought to hold him in contempt that he will not be intimidated. Appearing before a House panel led by allies of former President Donald Trump, Garland condemned the conspiracy theory that the department was behind Trump's state court prosecution in New York, in which the former Republican president was convicted of 34 felony charges, and he pushed back against, again, quote, baseless and extremely dangerous falsehoods being peddled about law enforcement. AP article continues his appearance came as Republicans have moved to hold him in contempt for the Biden administration's refusal to hand over audio of President Joe Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur, which focused on the president's handling of classified documents. A transcript of Biden's interview has been made public, but the president asserted executive privilege over the audio last month to block its release. Reporting from the Associated Press, Attorney General Merrick Garland testified before the House Judiciary Committee. Here's a minute of his opening statement.
It comes alongside false claims that a jury verdict in a state trial brought by a local district attorney was somehow controlled by the Justice Department. That conspiracy theory is an attack on the judicial process itself. It comes as individual career agents and prosecutors have been singled out just for doing their jobs. It comes as baseless and extremely dangerous falsehoods are being spread about the FBI's law enforcement operations. And it comes at a time when we are seeing heinous threats of violence being directed at the Justice Department's career civil servants. These repeated attacks on the Justice Department are unprecedented and they are unfounded. These attacks have not and they will not influence our decision-making. I view contempt as a serious matter, but I will not jeopardize the ability of our prosecutors and agents to do their jobs effectively in future investigations. I will not be intimidated, and the Justice Department will not be intimidated.
Attorney General Merrick Garland, part of his opening statement as a witness before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. Many of the questions from the committee members dealt with the Donald Trump hush money trial verdict last week. Here's Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican of Florida.
Attorney General, you've told us that it's a dangerous conspiracy theory to allege that the Department of Justice is communicating with these state and local prosecutions against Trump. You can clear it all up for us right now. Will the Department of Justice provide to the committee all documents, all correspondence between the department and Alvin Bragg's office and Fonnie Willis' office and Letitia James's office?
The offices you're referring to are independent offices of state.
I get that. The question is whether or not you will provide all of your documents and correspondence. That's the question. I don't need a history lesson.
Well, I'm going to say again, we do not control those offices. They make their own decisions.
The question is whether you communicate with them, not whether you control them. Do you communicate with them, and will you provide those communications?
If you make a request, we'll refer it to our Office of Legislative Affairs.
But see, here's the thing. You come in here and you lodge this attack that it's a conspiracy theory, that there is coordinated lawfare against Trump. And then when we say, fine, just give us the documents, give us the correspondence, and then if it's a conspiracy theory, that will be evident. But when you say, well, we'll take your request, and then we'll sort of work it through the DOJ's accommodation process, then you're actually advancing the very dangerous conspiracy theory that you're concerned about. Now, you were a judge, once nominated the highest court in our country. When you were a judge, I'm just curious, did you ever make political donations to partisan candidates?
No.
No, and you didn't because that would create the potential appearance of impropriety.
I didn't because there's a federal rule barring federal judges from making contributions.
Right, but under that same theory of attacks on the judicial process, like shouldn't someone be owed like a jury of their peers and a judge that's non-biased rather than getting a judge from your political opponent's donor file?
I'm well aware that you're not asking a hypothetical. You're asking me to comment on a jury verdict in another jurisdiction which has to be respected. I won't comment on it. That case is still ongoing. The defendant
Mr. Attorney General, I hadn't asked you about the verdict yet. We were getting there. I was talking about the judge.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, questioning Attorney General Merrick Garland at today's Judiciary Committee hearing. Congressman Gaetz also accused the Attorney General of dispatching a prosecutor who worked on the hush money case and previously worked in the Justice Department to get Trump. And Attorney General said that's a falsehood as well. Later in the hearing, the Donald Trump hush money trial came up again with questions from Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California.
Let me address the conspiracy theory of the day, which is somehow President Biden, through your department, has convicted Donald Trump in Manhattan in an effort to weaponize justice against the former president. So let me just ask some basic questions about this phony conspiracy theory. Did you appoint Alvin Bragg to be Manhattan DA?
No.
Of course not. He's elected. Did you select the jury in that case?
The judge selected the jury.
Did you select the judge in that case?
No.
No, of course not. The judge was randomly selected. Did you select the jury in that case?
No.
The jury was actually selected by Donald Trump and his attorneys. Did you reach a verdict in that case?
No.
Did you instruct the jury in that case?
No.
Did you tell the prosecutor what charges to bring in that case?
No.
This was 12 ordinary New Yorkers who weighed the evidence and found Donald Trump guilty of 34 felonies. And instead of celebrating the fact that in this country, an ordinary group of jurors, an ordinary group of 12 people can still adjudicate a case involving one of the most powerful people in the country, no, they would denigrate the whole system. They would tear it down. In the service of this convicted felon, they would tear everything down. They would tear the house of this democracy down around them. They say it's unprecedented to bring charges against a former president. You're damn right it's unprecedented. We've never had a president of the United States who was making hush money payments to a porn star and then falsifying business records to cover it up. Yeah, that's unprecedented. We've never had a president withhold classified information and then obstruct the investigation. That is unprecedented. We've never had a president incite a violent attack on the Capitol. That is unprecedented. And you know what else is unprecedented? The fact that so many leaders of that party are perfectly fine with all of that.
Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California, questioning Attorney General Merrick Garland at today's Judiciary Committee hearing. House Speaker Mike Johnson, at his news conference today, spoke about a three-pronged strategy to address the alleged weaponization of the Department of Justice. The Speaker said, we're looking at various approaches to what can be done here through the appropriations process, through the legislative process, through bills that will be advancing through our committees and put on the floor for passage, and through oversight. All those things will be happening vigorously. This is Washington Today. From military.com, the White House is threatening to veto the annual Department of Veterans Affairs and Military Construction funding bill over GOP-backed riders that would undo VA policies on LGBTQ plus veterans and abortion. The bill, as written by House Republicans, quote, includes numerous partisan policy provisions with devastating consequences, including harming access to reproductive health care, threatening the health and safety of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex Americans, endangering marriage equality, hindering critical climate change initiatives, and preventing the administration from promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. The White House Budget Office said in a statement on Monday. That was from military.com. That bill was debated on the House floor today. Congressman Ben Cline, Republican of Virginia, was in favor.
I'm pleased today to speak in support of this year's Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Bill. Under current leadership, the Veterans Health Administration has been distracted from its core mission, using official resources for political purposes, such as lobbying Congress, pushing for DEI policies, and even going so far as to process medical care claims for illegal aliens. Our veterans deserve better. Therefore, House Republicans are moving forward with a bill that refocuses the VA back to its core mission by fully funding veterans' health care programs and benefits while cutting out radical prerogatives that divert resources away from critical veterans' care. In addition to supporting those who have served, this bill would bolster our national security interests in the Indo-Pacific region to counter China by improving our defense posture in the region. The funding allocated in this bill would equip our active duty service members by constructing the facilities they so desperately need and honor our commitment to the veterans who have so dutifully served us here at home.
Congressman Ben Cline, Republican from Virginia, on the House floor. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat from Florida, spoke against the bill.
This bill is usually first up on the floor, like we are this fiscal year, because we have a bipartisan process. But unfortunately, partisan culture war riders have distracted from our ability to accomplish that. We have riders that include preventing the VA from implementing its interim final rule on abortion care, which is now final, by the way, to provide abortion services under limited circumstances, abortion counseling, and to ensure that veterans have equal access to health care regardless of what state they live in, especially in a time when reproductive rights are under attack around the country. A woman's decision whether or not to have an abortion should be made between her and her doctor and her family. It should not be made by politicians in this chamber. And this bill includes riders that do everything from prohibiting VA from implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, as well as training, to a petty, bigoted prohibition from flying the pride flag over VA facilities during Pride Month to add insult to injury, from protecting people who speak or act under the guise of religious freedom, essentially authorizing the arbitrary discrimination against LGBTQI plus people, and to prohibiting access to gender-affirming care, just to name a few, all aimed to disenfranchise veterans from the VA. Let me just note, the United States did not make exceptions to the promises that we made our service members in exchange for their service and sacrifice. We made promises to everyone. This bill undermines VA's ability to report a beneficiary to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System to keep guns out of the hands of people who are prohibited under federal law from purchasing or possessing firearms. It is prohibiting VA from following the law that is intended to protect veterans and those around them. We have a dramatic suicide problem among our veteran population, and allowing people who are prohibited by law to possess a gun makes that suicide more likely, not less, puts other people around them in their care circle at risk. That is unacceptable, irresponsible, and unnecessary.
Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat from Florida, ranking member on the Appropriations Subcommittee that oversees this bill, debating it on the House floor. She also mentioned the funding levels in opposing the bill. CQ Roll Call reports that it provides a total of $147.5 billion in discretionary spending for fiscal year 2025 for military construction, Veterans Affairs Department, medical care, and other agencies, as well as $210.4 billion in mandatory funding for VA pensions and benefits. In addition, $24.5 billion in mandatory funding from last year's debt limit law to treat veterans for medical conditions related to their exposure to toxins would also be available, thereby making available a total of $382.4 billion for the year. The discretionary total is $6.4 billion, 4% less than fiscal year 2024. And the CQ roll call analysis has this as well. House Republicans again this year are ignoring the 2023 debt limit agreement's side deal for additional non-defense spending, which would result in severe cuts to most non-defense spending. The House plans to continue work on amendments to the Military Construction Veterans Affairs spending bill for fiscal year 2025 on Wednesday and have final passage as well. Wall Street today, the Dow up 140, NASDAQ up 28, S&P up 7. Washington today continues in a moment.
The House will be in order.
This year, C-SPAN celebrates 45 years of covering Congress like no other. Since 1979, we've been your primary source for Capitol Hill, providing balanced, unfiltered coverage of government, taking you to where the policy's debated and decided, all with the support of America's cable companies. C-SPAN, 45 years and counting, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today. It's available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now free mobile app. The House today passed a bill to sanction the International Criminal Court after its lead prosecutor sought arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, all relating to the war against Hamas in Gaza. The sanctions in this bill would include denying or revoking visas to enter the United States, freezing assets in the U.S., and restricting transactions in financial markets. Sponsor of the bill, Congressman Chip Roy, Republican of Texas, who said in debate on the House floor that the issue is protecting not only an ally sovereignty, but U.S. sovereignty as well.
We're here because the International Criminal Court is seeking to issue warrants on the Prime Minister of Israel. It merits letting that just sit out here and marinate for a second, that that's what we're dealing with. The Prime Minister of Israel, who is engaged in defending his country after the horrific October 7th attacks, which we have talked about in great detail on this floor. The assaults, the rapes, the beheadings of babies, the killing of innocent civilians, what happened and what occurred on our Jewish brothers and sisters and others in Israel on October 7th. And Israel is responding to that and taking the attack to Hamas. We recognize the difficulty of that, of Hamas being fully intertwined with the civilians in Gaza. The steps that Israel is taking to send text messages, drop 15 million leaflets or more, leave voice messages, give 2 weeks advance notice, do what they can to try to make sure that there's protections for civilians, keeping the overall civilian to combatant casualty below historic norms by most accounts, including third-party observation. Now looking into Rafah, when the international community is saying you can't go into Rafah, and you go into Rafah and you find 50 plus tunnels, I think now 75 or more tunnels where we know they were being used to carry out attacks on Israel. Israel is under assault right now with missiles being fired with regularity by Hamas into Israel. This is Israel. This is not some random entity. This is Israel, our close ally. And you've got a body to which we do have no sovereignty for this country that is being given to the International Criminal Court because we're not a party to it. We're not undermining our sovereignty. We're not going to do that as America. That's what this stands for. That's what this says. This says that we should not be allowing the International Criminal Court to not just go after the Israeli prime minister, but the door that opens to go after our own service members, to go after our own generals, to go after America's interests. Because what happens here is going to be coming at us and our country.
Congressman Chip Roy, Republican from Texas, on the House floor. Congresswoman Delia Ramirez, Democrat from Illinois, spoke in opposition to the bill.
I've realized a pattern here. When my Republican colleagues can't legislate, they decide that they're going to score cheap points in three primary tools: fear-mongering, punishing, and silencing. So I want to break down a little bit of this bill today. Fear-mongering. The bill invokes the protection of United States military personnel. Now, let me clarify. The U.S. military personnel is not subject to the ICC because the United States is not a party to the Rome Statute, which I find shameful. Punishing, because the bill would impose sanctions against anyone who aids the ICC in investigating, in detaining, in arresting, or prosecuting anyone who has not consented to the court's jurisdiction. Let me clarify. Let me do that point of clarification here. The bill would weaponize sanctions against major U.S. allies who support the court. Allies like Germany, France, the UK, Japan, and countless others. Silencing how? If enacted, no funding may be used for the International Criminal Court. Another point of clarification, those efforts would weaken the ICC, and that makes us all less safe. It's important we remember why the ICC exists as defined by the Rome Statute. Mindful that during the century, millions of children, women, and men have been victims of unimaginable atrocity that deeply shocked the conscience of humanity. It recognizes that such grave crimes threaten the peace, the security, and the well-being of the world, and determined to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes, and thus contribute to the prevention of such crimes. I stand in opposition of this resolution because we need the ICC. In the last 241 days, thousands have been victims of unimaginable atrocities. And Netanyahu's violations of international law have threatened the peace of the world. I'm determined to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes, and I urge a no vote.
Congresswoman Delia Ramirez, Democrat from Illinois, on the House floor. The House passed this legislation to sanction the International Criminal Court officials involved in seeking arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister. The vote was 247 to 155, with 2 voting present. 42 Democrats joined all Republicans in voting yes. 2 Republicans voted present, Davidson of Ohio and Massey of Kentucky. The bill now heads to the Senate. At the State Department briefing today, spokesperson Matthew Miller was asked about President Biden's position.
U.S. House of Representatives is due to vote on this legislation that would sanction ICC after its prosecutor applied for arrest warrant for Netanyahu and others. The U.S. State Department supports this.
So we have made clear that while we oppose the decision taken by the prosecutor of the ICC, we don't think it was appropriate, especially while there are ongoing investigations inside Israel looking at some of these very same questions. And we are willing to work with Congress on what a response might look like. We don't support sanctions.
Right, and what would that response look like then if you don't support sanctions?
So that is a consultation that we will have with Congress. I'm not going to preview it from here. Those are discussions we need to have with members of Congress. But our position as the administration is that we don't support sanctions, don't believe they're appropriate at this time.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference. President Biden said in an interview with Time magazine on May 28th, the transcript was released today, that there is, quote, every reason to think that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is prolonging the war against Hamas in Gaza for political gain. And this came up today during an online audio news conference with White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby. He was also asked about the fate of the 3-phase ceasefire and Gaza reconstruction plan that President Biden outlined last Friday, saying it came from Israel. But since then, Prime Minister Netanyahu has offered a different interpretation of what is in it.
Qatari spokesman just came out and said something interesting, so I wonder if you could just elucidate a little bit, that Qatar has received a formal Israeli proposal for the hostage deal as outlined by the president on Friday. We talked yesterday about how Hamas received this proposal in writing on Thursday night. So can you just kind of square that circle? What is the status of whatever it is in writing, who's approved it, and who sent it to whom? And then just an elucidation on one of the president's quotations in his Time piece. Time asked the president this question: some in Israel have suggested Netanyahu's prolonging the war for his own political self-preservation. Do you believe that? The president's answer was, I'm not going to comment on that, period. There is every reason for people to draw that conclusion, period. And then he goes on to talk about the domestic unrest over the judicial changes. So can you just try and translate for us what the president was trying to say? Thanks.
On the first question, Nick, I have not seen those comments by a Qatari spokesman. All I can do is go back before that proposal had been transmitted to Hamas on Thursday night. So we'll go back and take a look at what the spokesman said, and if there's some additional context that needs to be provided, I'll have the team do that. But we stand by our comments before that. The proposal was transmitted to Hamas on Thursday evening before the president's speech. On your second question,
sorry, John, just to confirm. So, and Hamas has not provided a formal response yet. Is that right?
That is correct. On your second question, I think the president was very clear in his answer on that, and we'll let the prime minister speak to his own politics and to what his critics are saying. And the president was referencing what many critics have said. For our part, though he and Prime Minister Netanyahu do not agree on everything, and he talked in that interview about some of the things they don't agree on, such as on a two-state solution. But for our part, we're going to make sure that Israel has what it needs to continue to eliminate the threat by Hamas, and that we're going to continue to work with the Prime Minister and the War Cabinet to try to get this proposal over the finish line. A proposal, I would add, that was an Israeli proposal that they crafted after some diplomatic conversations with us, and which they've acknowledged is their proposal. So that's what our focus is going to be on.
John Kirby, White House National Security Communications Advisor, in an online audio-only news conference. President Biden was asked about his Time magazine comment about the Prime Minister of Israel at the end of his remarks today on U.S. border security at the White House.
Is Netanyahu playing politics with the war? What was that? I asked her, is Prime Minister Netanyahu playing politics with the war?
I don't think so. He's trying to work out a serious problem he has. Thank you.
President Biden travels tonight to France for the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion during World War II. The anniversary is Thursday. The ceremonies will be then. Next week, he's back in Europe for a summit in Italy with the leaders of the Group of 7 leading industrialized democracies. And 3 weeks later, President Biden hosts the 75th anniversary summit of NATO nations in Washington, D.C. From AFP, the United States vowed Tuesday to never stop promoting human rights in China 35 years after the bloody crackdown in Tiananmen Square, as the protest movement's exiled leaders pleaded for action to help keep the memory alive, with China meticulously censoring any mention of the 1989 student uprising, a blackout increasingly extended to once open Hong Kong. Tiananmen Square veterans commemorated the anniversary overseas, including the United States and Taiwan. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who has visited Beijing twice since last year as he sought to ease tensions, did not hold back from calling the events at Tiananmen Square a massacre. He said in a statement, as Beijing attempts to suppress the memory of June 4th, the United States stands in solidarity with those who continue to struggle for human rights and individual freedom. The courage and sacrifice of the people who stood up in Tiananmen Square 35 years ago will not be forgotten. That's reporting from AFP. On Capitol Hill in Washington, the leaders of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party led a news conference. John Molinar, Republican of Michigan, is the chair.
We're here because 35 years ago, hundreds of thousands of students and workers gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, joined by millions more across China to demand democracy. The CCP chose to stamp them out crushing calls for freedom under communist tanks. My colleague Raj and I lead the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. Our name is deliberate. Our strategic competition is not with a nation or a people, but with the regime that holds 1.3 billion humans under its authoritarian thumb. For 75 years, the greatest victims of the CCP have been the Chinese people themselves. Tens of millions have lost their lives, with countless more reduced to forced labor. The rest live in fear and oppression. The best anyone can hope for under the rule of the CCP is to be ignored, that if they remain silent, the party just might forget that they exist. The brave men and women with us today refuse to be silent. They refuse to hide. They refuse to repeat the party line that the CCP represents the Chinese people.
Congressman John Molinar, Republican from Michigan, at a news conference outside the U.S. Capitol building in Washington. He referred to Raj, that's the ranking Democrat on the House CCP Select Committee, Raja Krishnamurthy from California.
Today we have to remember that when Chairman Xi Jinping says he will, quote, crack down hard on subversion and separatist activities, and that he will crack down on enemy forces, he's telling the world that the CCP will send those tanks again against anyone that stands up for freedom, and he will deem his own people enemies of the state. We've seen this in Xinjiang. We've seen this in Tibet. We saw this last week in Hong Kong, where a man who was commemorating the Tiananmen Square massacre was thrown into jail because he was allegedly peddling in, quote, seditious content. And so today we say in one voice, in a bipartisan fashion, no more silence. No more silence about the Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang. No more silence about Tiananmen Square. No more silence about the cultural genocide happening in Tibet. No more silence about the political persecution that countless others are facing today in the People's Republic of China. Instead, we're going to stand for freedom. We're going to stand with anyone who does the same.
Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, Democrat from California, at a news conference on Capitol Hill. A story from Reuters says that decades after the military crackdown, rights activists say the demonstrators' original goals, including a free press and freedom of speech, remain distant, and June 4th is still a taboo topic in China. The ruling Communist Party has never released a death toll, though rights groups and witnesses say the figure could run into the thousands. And a story from CNN, India's transformative yet divisive Prime Minister Narendra Modi declared victory in national elections on Tuesday evening, but his goal of winning an unassailable majority lies in tatters, with early results showing voters delivered a shock result that reduces the extent of his party's grip on power. Modi told cheering supporters at his party headquarters in New Delhi, "Today is a glorious day. National Democratic Alliance is going to form the government for the third time. We are grateful to the people. This is a victory for the world's largest democracy." Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter, Word for Word, and you'll get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.